My name is Fanny, and at 58, I've spent the last 15 years building a successful catering business from scratch after losing my husband. I raised two wonderful sons on my own. Michael, my oldest at 32, was always my rock until he met Veronica 3 years ago. I never imagined that on my son's wedding day, the bride would point her finger at me in front of 200 guests and shout those words that still echo in my mind. What happened next changed everything between us. If you're watching this from anywhere in the world, hit that like button and subscribe to hear the full story of how pulling my wedding funds taught my son and his bride the most important lesson about respect and family. I grew up in a small town outside of Boston, raised by parents who believed in hard work, honesty, and treating people with respect. My father worked at the local post office for 40 years, and my mother was an elementary school teacher. We weren't wealthy by any means, but my parents made sure we never wanted for anything important. They taught me that character matters more than possessions, a lesson I carried into adulthood and tried to pass on to my own children. I met Robert during my second year of culinary school. He was tall and kind, with a laugh that could fill a room and hands that created magic in the kitchen. We shared the same dream, to someday own our own restaurant where we could share our love of food with others. We got married a year after graduation, both of us working in different restaurants around Boston to gain experience and save money for our future. Michael came along 2 years later, a serious baby with his father's thoughtful eyes. James followed 3 years after that, more rambunctious and free-spirited than his brother. Robert and I balanced our work schedules, so one of us was always home with the boys. We couldn't afford much in those early days, but our small apartment was filled with love, laughter, and the constant aroma of whatever new recipe we were experimenting with. By the time Michael was 12 and James was 9, Robert and I had saved enough to start looking at small spaces for our own restaurant. We were so close to our dream, spending evenings at the kitchen table reviewing business plans and potential locations. Then came the morning that changed everything. Robert was driving to work in heavy rain when a truck lost control on the highway. The police said he died instantly. I was 38 years old, suddenly a widow with 2 young boys to raise alone and a shattered dream. The first year after Robert's death is still a blur in my memory. The life insurance helped cover immediate expenses, but it wasn't enough to sustain us long term. I had to sell our house and move to a smaller apartment. The boys had to switch schools. Every day was a struggle just to keep moving forward, to keep smiling for Michael and James, when all I wanted to do was collapse. What saved me was cooking. In those darkest moments, I would retreat to the kitchen, where I could still feel Robert's presence beside me. One day, a neighbor asked if I would cater a small retirement party. I agreed, grateful for the extra income. The guests were so impressed that 3 of them asked for my card, which I didn't have. I wrote my phone number on recipe cards and handed them out. That was the humble beginning of Fanny's Home-Style Catering. I started small, working from my apartment kitchen, taking any job that came my way. Birthday parties, office lunches, family gatherings. Michael, then 13, would help me prep vegetables after school. James would charm the clients when they came for tastings. We were a team building something new from the ashes of our loss. As word spread about my food, the business grew. I saved every penny to buy better equipment, rent commercial kitchen space, hire part-time help. The hours were brutal, often 18-hour days starting at dawn to prep and ending late after cleaning up from events. Many nights I collapsed into bed still wearing my chef's coat, too exhausted to change. But those years of struggle paid off. By the time Michael started college, Fanny's Home-Style Catering had 6 full-time employees, a renovated storefront with a professional kitchen, and a reputation as one of the best mid-priced catering services in the Boston area. I wasn't rich, but I was comfortable enough to pay for Michael's education without him needing student loans, something that filled me with immense pride. Michael had always been my practical, responsible child. Even as a teenager, he understood the sacrifices I was making and tried to ease my burden however he could. He worked in the business throughout high school, learning every aspect from food prep to bookkeeping. Though he ultimately chose to study finance rather than culinary arts, he always said that watching me build the business inspired his career path. James was different, my free spirit who moved to California after college to work in tech. While we remained close, talking weekly by phone, it was Michael who stayed local, who came for Sunday dinners, who understood the legacy of what I had built. Secretly, I always hoped that someday he might want to take over the catering business, combining his financial acumen with the culinary foundation he'd absorbed growing up. I envisioned expanding, perhaps finally opening that restaurant that had been Robert's and my dream. By my mid-50s, I had created a good life. My business was thriving, allowing me to move back into a nice home. Not extravagant, but comfortable and warm, with a kitchen I had lovingly designed myself. I had friends, community, respect, and the deep satisfaction of knowing I had kept my family afloat through the hardest of times. When Michael called one Sunday evening 3 years ago to say he'd met someone special, I was overjoyed. At 29, he had dated casually, but never seemed to find anyone who truly captured his heart. He sounded different on the phone, a lightness in his voice I hadn't heard before. "Her name is Veronica," he said. "I really want you to meet her mom. I think she might be the one." I spent all day preparing for that first dinner, making Michael's favorites and planning a menu that would impress his new girlfriend. I wanted everything to be perfect to welcome this woman who had made my son so happy. Little did I know that this dinner would be the beginning of the most challenging chapter in my relationship with my son. The evening I first met Veronica remains vivid in my memory. I had spent the day preparing Michael's favorite dishes, my signature rosemary roasted chicken garlic, mashed potatoes with herbs from my garden, and the apple crumble that had been his father's recipe. I wanted to create a warm, inviting atmosphere that would make Veronica feel welcome in our family. When the doorbell rang at exactly 7 o'clock, I smoothed my apron, took a deep breath, and went to greet them. Michael stood there beaming his arm around a strikingly beautiful woman. Veronica was tall and slender with perfectly styled blonde hair and flawless makeup. She wore a simple black dress that I later recognized as designer, with elegant jewelry that caught the light as she moved. "Mom, this is Veronica," Michael said, his voice carrying a note of pride I hadn't heard before. "It's lovely to meet you," I said, extending my hand. "I've been looking forward to it." Veronica's handshake was brief, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. "What a quaint neighborhood," she commented as she stepped inside. "So authentic." I chose to take it as a compliment, though. Something in her tone gave me pause. As I led them into the living room, I noticed her gaze sweeping across my furnishings. The comfortable sofa I'd splurged on after a particularly successful catering season, the coffee table Michael and his father had built together, the family photos covering one wall. "Your home is very homey," she said, selecting her words carefully. "Michael mentioned you run a small catering business." "Not so small anymore," Michael interjected proudly. "Mom's built it from nothing into one of the most respected catering services in Boston." "How entrepreneurial," Veronica replied, her tone suggesting this was somehow surprising. "My father has always said the food service industry is one of the most challenging. So many fail within the first year." As we moved to the dining room for dinner, I learned that Veronica was the daughter of Edward Pierce, a well-known real estate developer responsible for several luxury high-rises in downtown Boston. She had attended an exclusive private school before getting her degree from Vassar and now worked in her father's company, handling public relations. Throughout the meal, I noticed that Veronica barely touched her food, moving it around her plate while engaging Michael in conversation about mutual friends I'd never heard him mention. People with surnames that doubled as street names in the wealthier parts of the city. "This is delicious, Mrs. Williams," she said at one point, though her plate remained nearly full. "I'm just on a rather strict dietary regimen. My nutritionist would have a fit." When I brought out the apple crumble, she declined completely. "Sugar is practically poison, don't you agree? Though I'm sure it's a lovely home recipe." Michael seemed oblivious to these subtle barbs, his eyes rarely leaving Veronica's face. When they did, it was to shoot me hopeful glances, silently asking for my approval. I smiled and nodded, keeping any reservations to myself. My son was happy, happier than I'd seen him in years, and that was what mattered. As the evening ended and they prepared to leave, Veronica turned to me with a practiced smile. "Thank you for such a rustic meal. It's refreshing to experience something so simple and unpretentious." After they left, I stood in my kitchen replaying the evening in my mind. Perhaps I was being oversensitive. Perhaps Veronica was simply nervous meeting her boyfriend's mother. Perhaps the cultural gap between our backgrounds made her comments seem more condescending than intended. I resolved to give her the benefit of the doubt. Over the following months, that resolution became increasingly difficult to maintain. Michael, who had previously joined me for Sunday dinner nearly every week, began canceling more often than not. Veronica's parents are hosting a yacht party, or we're attending a charity gala with Veronica's boss. The family traditions that had anchored us through difficult years seemed to evaporate overnight. When he did visit, it was usually alone, explaining that Veronica had other commitments. The few times she accompanied him, she arrived dressed as though for a photo shoot, making me feel underdressed in my own home. She would accept a small plate of whatever I had prepared, eat 2 or 3 bites, and then declare herself absolutely stuffed. More concerning were the changes I began to notice in Michael himself. My son, who had always taken pride in his pragmatic approach to money, a quality developed during those lean years after his father died, suddenly appeared with an expensive watch I knew he couldn't afford on his salary. His practical sedan was traded for a luxury car. His conversations began to include references to exclusive clubs and restaurants I had never heard of. When I gently asked about these changes, Michael became defensive. "I'm moving up in the world, Mom. Veronica's helping me see the opportunities I've been missing." 6 months after they began dating, Michael called to announce they were engaged. Rather than sharing the news over Sunday dinner, as I might have expected, he delivered it via phone on a Tuesday afternoon while I was prepping for a corporate event. "That's wonderful news." I managed, caught off guard by both the news and the impersonal delivery. "I'm happy for you, Michael. When can we celebrate together?" Actually, Veronica's parents are hosting an engagement party at Westfield Country Club this Saturday. Very last minute, but her father insisted. "You'll come, right?" The engagement party was my first glimpse into Veronica's world. The country club was opulent, the guest list extensive, and I recognized several faces from local news and society pages. I wore my best dress, a navy blue cocktail dress I'd purchased for a charity event the previous year, yet still felt conspicuously underdressed among women dripping in designer labels. Edward and Margaret Pierce, Veronica's parents, greeted me with the practiced politeness of people accustomed to networking. "So you're Michael's mother," Margaret said, her eyes assessing me quickly. "Veronica mentioned you have a little catering company. How charming." Throughout the evening, I circulated awkwardly, acutely aware that I knew virtually no one. Michael was constantly pulled away by Veronica to meet important connections, leaving me to make small talk with distant relatives and business associates. During one such moment alone, I overheard Veronica speaking to a group of friends near the bar. "Michael comes from such humble beginnings," she was saying, glass of champagne, gesturing elegantly. "But he's incredibly smart and ambitious, completely salvageable with the right guidance." Salvageable. As if my son were a damaged piece of furniture rather than a successful professional who had worked his way through college while helping support his family. As if the values of hard work and integrity I had raised him with were somehow deficiencies to be corrected. When I mentioned this comment to Michael the following day, his reaction surprised me. Rather than being offended, he became defensive. "You probably misheard, Mom, and even if you didn't, you're being too sensitive. Veronica's just from a different world. She doesn't always express things the way we would." "Michael, she spoke about you like a project, not a partner." His face hardened in a way I hadn't seen before. "You need to try harder with her, Mom. This relationship is important to me. Veronica's family has connections that could take my career to a whole new level." I bit back further comments, recognizing the determination in his expression. Instead, I did what mothers often do. I swallowed my concerns and offered support. "I want you to be happy, Michael, and I've always dreamed of helping with your wedding someday. I'd like to pay for it as I've planned to do for both you and James." His expression softened immediately. "Really? That would be amazing, Mom. Veronica has such wonderful ideas, but weddings can be expensive these days." "Whatever you need," I promised, wanting desperately to remain connected to my son during this important life transition. "It's what your father would have wanted too." Little did I know that this generous offer would become the leverage for my own exclusion from one of the most important days of my son's life. The initial wedding planning meeting took place at an upscale cafe in downtown Boston, the kind with $15 lattes and uncomfortable artistic chairs. I arrived 10 minutes early, notebook in hand, excited to be part of this special process. Michael had texted that morning to say he couldn't make it, something about an important client meeting, but that Veronica and her mother would fill him in later. Veronica and Margaret arrived 15 minutes late, both impeccably dressed and seemingly unbothered by their tardiness. Margaret immediately took charge, pulling out a leather portfolio embossed with her initials. "We've already made some preliminary inquiries," she announced without preamble. "The Beaumont Hotel has an opening next June that we've temporarily reserved. It's the premier wedding venue in the city. Congressman Harrington's daughter was married there last year." "That sounds lovely," I said, though I'd been imagining something more personal for Michael. "I didn't realize you'd already started looking at venues." "One must move quickly with desirable locations," Margaret replied dismissively. "Now about catering. We've spoken with Blanchet's. They're really the only choice for an event of this caliber. $300 per plate, but absolutely worth every penny." I hesitated, seeing an opportunity to contribute meaningfully. "Actually, I was thinking perhaps my catering company could—" "Oh, goodness, no," Margaret interrupted with a laugh that felt like a slap. "This is a society wedding, Fanny. Your little business is charming for office parties, I'm sure, but this requires a certain level of sophistication." Veronica nodded in agreement. "We need to impress Daddy's business associates. Several major developers will be there, and the mayor has tentatively accepted our invitation." The conversation continued in this vein, with Margaret and Veronica outlining plans for a wedding that sounded more like a corporate merger celebration than a personal milestone. 300 guests, many of whom Michael had never met, custom-designed invitations from a boutique stationer, a 10-piece orchestra for the ceremony, and a celebrity DJ for the reception. I sat quietly taking notes, each item adding to a mental tally that made my stomach clench. When Margaret mentioned a wedding cake that alone would cost $5,000, I finally spoke up. "This all sounds very elaborate. I'd budgeted around $40,000 for the entire wedding, which I thought was quite generous." Margaret and Veronica exchanged a look I couldn't quite interpret. "$40,000 barely covers the venue and basic catering," Veronica said slowly, as if explaining something to a child. "A wedding of this caliber starts at $100,000 minimum." The number hit me like a physical blow. $100,000 was more than a third of my retirement savings. It represented years of early mornings, late nights, aching feet, and burned fingers. It was money I'd carefully set aside to secure my future after a lifetime of financial uncertainty. "That's significantly more than I anticipated," I admitted. "Perhaps we could look at ways to scale back while still making it special. I'm sure Michael would understand." "Michael understands the importance of appearances in our world," Veronica replied coolly. "He's eager to make the right impression with my father's colleagues." "We could contribute the difference," Margaret suggested, though her tone made it clear this was not her preference. "But naturally that would mean we'd have more say in the decisions." In that moment, I faced a choice that would define the months to follow. I could stand firm on my budget, potentially creating conflict and risking my already tenuous relationship with my future daughter-in-law. Or I could stretch far beyond my comfort zone financially to maintain peace and give Michael the wedding his fiancée desired. Like many mothers before me, I chose my child's happiness over my own security. "No need for that," I heard myself saying. "I can manage it. I just want Michael to have a beautiful day." The smile that spread across Veronica's face didn't reach her eyes. "Wonderful. Then we can proceed as planned." Over the following months, I watched from the sidelines as my role in the wedding planning diminished from participant to checkbook. Decisions were made without my input, then presented as fate's accomplice, requiring only my payment. The guest list expanded to include names I'd never heard. The budget swelled with additions like custom monogrammed napkins and imported flowers. Each time I questioned an expense, I was made to feel unsophisticated for not understanding the necessities of a proper wedding. When I suggested more affordable alternatives, Veronica would sigh dramatically and say, "I suppose we could go with something more budget-friendly, if that's all that's possible." The implied criticism always ended with me conceding writing another check, withdrawing more from my savings. Michael, when I occasionally voiced concerns to him, would assure me that everything was standard for weddings these days, and thank me for my generosity. Traditional mother-of-the-groom activities were systematically eliminated. When I offered to host a bridal shower, Margaret informed me she'd already arranged one at her country club. When I mentioned accompanying Veronica to dress fittings, I was told the appointments were already overbooked with bridesmaids. Perhaps most hurtful was the conversation about the rehearsal dinner. As is customary, I offered to host it at my restaurant, the commercial kitchen and event space I'd purchased 2 years earlier, the culmination of decades of work. "Oh, that's sweet of you to offer," Veronica said, her tone making it clear the answer was no. "But we've already discussed it with Daddy, and he thinks Marcel's would be more appropriate. It's where he closes all his major deals." Marcel's requires a minimum of $15,000 for a private event. I pointed out my frustration finally showing. "My restaurant is beautiful, and the food would be exceptional. Michael loves it there." "Your place is just not sophisticated enough for the crowd we'll have," Veronica replied. "The rehearsal dinner sets the tone for the wedding. We can't have people eating in what's essentially a casual bistro." I wanted to protest that my restaurant had received glowing reviews from the city's top food critics, that it represented the dream my late husband and I had shared, that Michael had helped design the interior during its renovation. Instead, I swallowed my pride and agreed to pay for Marcel's, where I would later discover I was seated at a table far from the wedding party with distant relatives I'd never met. The night before the wedding, as I ironed my dress, a conservative blue number that had been tacitly approved after I'd sent photos of 3 options to Veronica, I found myself fighting back tears. Tomorrow should have been one of the happiest days of my life watching my firstborn marry. Instead, I felt like an unwelcome outsider tolerated only for my checkbook. I told myself it would get better after the wedding. Once the stress of planning was behind us, surely Michael would return to the son I knew. Surely Veronica would relax her guard. Surely we would find a way to become family. With that hope in mind, I carefully packed the small velvet box containing the gold pocket watch that had belonged to Robert. It was the only significant heirloom I had to offer Michael on his wedding day, a tangible connection to the father who would have been so proud to see him marry. Despite everything, I was determined to make this meaningful gesture to remind my son of his roots and the love that had shaped him. I fell asleep clinging to the belief that tomorrow would bring reconciliation, not knowing it would instead bring the most public humiliation of my life. I woke before dawn on Michael's wedding day, my stomach fluttering with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. The June morning was already warm, promising the perfect weather we'd hoped for. I dressed carefully in my blue dress, applied subtle makeup, and styled my hair in the simple updo I'd practiced the week before. The wedding was scheduled for 4 o'clock at the Beaumont Hotel, but I arrived at 11, assuming I'd be needed for preparations and photos. The hotel lobby was a flurry of activity, with staff arranging elaborate floral displays and setting up a welcome table with escort cards in calligraphy. "I'm Michael Williams's mother," I told the concierge. "The wedding preparations." He consulted his tablet. "Ah, yes, the Pierce Williams wedding. The bridal party is in the Regent Suite on the 10th floor." When I reached the suite, I found the door guarded by a young woman with a clipboard and a Bluetooth earpiece, the wedding planner's assistant, whom I'd met briefly at the rehearsal. "Mrs. Williams, hello," she said, checking her list. "I don't see you on the preparation schedule." "I'm the mother of the groom," I explained, confused. "I thought I should be here to help Michael get ready." "Mr. Williams is with his groomsmen in the Windsor suite. The mothers aren't scheduled to join until pre-ceremony photos at 2:30. Her tone was apologetic but firm. Mrs. Pierce's instructions were very specific about who's allowed in during preparations. I stood there, purse clutched in my hands, feeling oddly like a gatecrasher at my own son's wedding. "I see. Well, perhaps I could just look in on Michael briefly." "I can ask the wedding planner," she offered, touching her earpiece. After a brief conversation with someone I couldn't hear, she shook her head. "I'm sorry, but they're in the middle of the formal portraits with the groomsmen. Any interruption would throw off the photography timeline." With 3 hours to kill before I was scheduled to participate, I retreated to the hotel restaurant for a solitary lunch, picking at a salad I couldn't taste. Around me, other hotel guests dined and chatted, utterly unaware of my isolation on what should have been one of the most meaningful days of my life. At precisely 2:30, I presented myself again at the Windsor suite. This time I was admitted to find Michael and his groomsmen in matching tuxedos, champagne glasses in hand. My son looked handsome and nervous, his face breaking into a genuine smile when he saw me. "Mom." He embraced me, smelling of expensive cologne. "You look beautiful." For a moment he was my Michael again, the boy who had stood beside me through our darkest days. I held on to that moment, savoring it. "I have something for you," I said, producing the velvet box from my purse. "It was your father's. He would have wanted you to have it today." Michael opened the box, his expression softening at the sight of the gold pocket watch. "Dad's watch," he whispered, running his thumb over the engraved lid. "He wore it at our wedding," I told him. "It was his father's before that. I had it cleaned and serviced for you." Michael seemed about to say something meaningful when the door opened and the wedding planner entered, clipboard in hand. "Photo time with mothers," she announced briskly. "Mrs. Pierce is waiting in the grand ballroom." The formal photography session was a carefully choreographed production. Margaret Pierce dominated the proceedings, positioning herself prominently in every configuration while I was directed to stand at the edges. The photographer, clearly aware of who was signing his check, focused his attention on capturing Margaret's good side. "Mrs. Williams, your dress is competing with the bridal colors," the wedding planner said at one point, though the shade had been pre-approved by Veronica herself. "Let's move you to the back row for this series." I complied without protest, not wanting to create tension. This wasn't about me, I reminded myself. It was about Michael. Yet I couldn't help noticing that the watch I'd given him was nowhere to be seen, replaced by platinum cufflinks that matched the groomsmen's. As the photography session continued, I overheard snippets of conversation between Veronica and her bridesmaids. "Can you believe she wore that color after I specifically said muted tones?" Veronica muttered to her maid of honor. "It's like she's trying to stand out." "At least you only have to deal with her at holidays," another bridesmaid replied. "My mother-in-law practically lives at our house." God, can you imagine Michael knows I'd never allow that. Thankfully, he agrees she's a bit embarrassing. Each word was a needle, but I maintained my smile, telling myself they were just pre-wedding jitters making Veronica tense. Surely she didn't mean these cruel assessments. Surely my son hadn't agreed with them. The ceremony itself was undeniably beautiful, if impersonal. The hotel ballroom had been transformed into a garden of white orchids and crystal accents, with a string quartet playing classical selections as guests were seated. I was escorted not to the front row as tradition dictated for parents, but to the third row behind various Pierce relatives and business associates. When Margaret was escorted to her seat in the front row center, she made a show of arranging her designer dress, accepting the admiring glances of nearby guests. I watched as Michael, standing at the altar, gave her a warm smile and nod of acknowledgement. He didn't look back to where I sat. As Veronica appeared in a gown that had cost more than my first car, the assembled guests gasped appreciatively. She was objectively a stunning bride. Michael's face, as he watched her approach, showed nothing but adoration. In that moment, I set aside my hurt feelings, genuinely happy to see my son so in love. The reception began with cocktails in an adjoining ballroom, while the ceremony space was transformed for dinner. I circulated awkwardly, introducing myself to guests who seemed surprised to learn Michael had a mother. Most conversations died quickly once people ascertained I wasn't connected to the real estate world or Boston high society. During dinner, I was seated at a table far from the wedding party with distant cousins of the Pierces and a couple of Michael's former colleagues he hadn't seen in years. We made polite conversation while watching the head table where Veronica's father was giving a lengthy toast about merging two great families, though he never actually mentioned my name or acknowledged my role in raising Michael. The first sign of real trouble came when I approached the bar for a glass of wine. The bartender informed me they were out of the premium red I'd requested. "That's odd," I said. "We paid for top-shelf open bar service." "We're serving house wines now, ma'am. Switch happened about an hour ago." Confused, I sought out the event coordinator, finding her near the cake display. "Excuse me, but there seems to be some confusion about the bar service. We contracted for premium beverages throughout the reception." She consulted her tablet with a frown. According to my records, there was a change 2 days ago. Standard bar package after the first hour. The difference was credited toward the floral upgrades. I didn't authorize that change, I said, bewilderment turning to anger. I'm paying for this wedding and I never agreed to downgrade the bar service. The bride made the change. She had authorization on the contract. She most certainly did not have authorization to change services I'm paying for without consulting me, I replied, my voice rising slightly despite my efforts to remain calm. As if summoned by this tension, Veronica appeared beside us, her expression one of practiced concern overlaying obvious irritation. "Is there a problem?" she asked, glancing between me and the coordinator. "Veronica, did you downgrade the bar service without telling me?" "Oh, that." She waved a dismissive hand. "It was a budget decision. Premium alcohol for 5 hours is wasteful. Most people can't tell the difference anyway. Budget decision, I'm paying for this wedding and I wasn't consulted." "Really, Fanny," she said, using my first name in a tone that suggested I was being childish. "It's just alcohol. No one cares except you." "That's not the point. The point is that you made a change to services I'm paying for without discussing it with me. What else has been changed that I don't know about?" Veronica's pleasant mask slipped, revealing the impatience beneath. "This is my wedding day. I don't have time to discuss every minor adjustment with you." "Minor adjustments don't include reallocating thousands of dollars," I countered, aware that nearby guests were beginning to take notice of our conversation. I lowered my voice. "We should discuss this privately." "There's nothing to discuss," Veronica snapped, her voice rising rather than falling. "You're being ridiculous over cheap wine. This is exactly the kind of behavior Michael warned might happen." The mention of my son sent a chill through me. "Michael discussed this with you. He said you might get obsessive about the money, that you've always been tight-fisted because of your background." She glanced around at the growing audience with something like satisfaction. "He said not to worry if you caused a scene, that you couldn't help being unsophisticated about these things." Each word struck like a physical blow. My son, my Michael, had anticipated I might object to their deception and had preemptively undermined me to his bride. The betrayal was breathtaking. "Where is Michael?" I asked, my voice steady, despite the storm inside me. "I'd like to speak with him." "He's networking with Daddy's associates where he should be." Veronica's eyes narrowed. "Not dealing with your penny-pinching drama." Something in me snapped. After months of swallowing insults, tolerating exclusion, and writing checks for a wedding that increasingly felt like a corporate merger, I had reached my limit. "I have contributed over $80,000 to this wedding," I said loud enough for nearby guests to hear. "Money earned through decades of hard work, building a business from nothing after my husband died. I deserve basic respect and honesty about how that money is being spent." Veronica's face flushed with anger. She stepped closer, jabbing a manicured finger toward me. "You're embarrassing yourself and Michael. This is my wedding day, and you're not going to ruin it with your middle-class martyrdom." "Veronica, please," the wedding coordinator interjected, clearly alarmed by the escalating scene. But Veronica was beyond discretion now, her voice rising to a near shout. "You're not welcome here. Go away. No one wants you here anyway, especially not Michael." A stunned silence fell over the nearby guests. In the distance, I could see Michael hurrying toward us, his expression a mixture of confusion and alarm. But he was too late to prevent the damage of his wife's words hanging in the air like poison. With as much dignity as I could muster, I picked up my purse from a nearby chair. "Congratulations on your wedding, Veronica. I hope it brings you everything you deserve." Without waiting for a response, I turned and walked steadily toward the exit, refusing to give anyone the satisfaction of seeing me run. As I passed Michael in the doorway, our eyes met briefly. I saw confusion there, perhaps a flicker of regret, but no move to stop me or defend me. That silence, more than Veronica's cruel words, confirmed what I needed to know. I continued walking out of the ballroom through the lobby and into the warm June evening, leaving behind the celebration I had sacrificed so much to provide. In my car, hands trembling on the steering wheel, I made a decision. If my contribution to this wedding was valued only for its monetary worth, then perhaps it was time to reconsider the terms of that contribution. With newfound clarity and determination, I pulled out my phone and began making calls. The drive home from the Beaumont Hotel took 25 minutes, during which I cycled through every emotion imaginable: hurt, betrayal, anger, grief, and finally, a strange, calm determination. By the time I pulled into my driveway, I had moved beyond the paralysis of shock into a space of clear, focused action. Inside my house, I went straight to my home office and opened the filing cabinet where I kept all the wedding documentation. Every contract, every invoice, every payment record was meticulously organized, a habit from years of running my own business. I spread them across my desk, creating a comprehensive map of the financial commitments I had made for Michael's wedding. As I reviewed the paperwork, I noticed something I hadn't paid attention to before. Most of the major vendors, the hotel, the caterer, the photographer, the florist, had similar payment structures: 50% deposit upon booking with the remaining balance due either the day of the event or immediately after. In most cases, I had paid the deposits months ago, but the final payments were either scheduled for automatic processing at midnight or due to be paid at the end of the reception. I picked up my phone and called Susan Chen, my attorney and friend of 15 years. She had helped me establish my business review commercial leases and navigate the occasional contract dispute with clients. "Susan, it's Fannie Williams. I'm sorry to bother you on a Saturday evening, but I have an urgent legal question." "Fannie, aren't you supposed to be at Michael's wedding right now?" The concern in her voice was evident. "That's actually why I'm calling. There's been a situation." I explained what had happened at the reception, Veronica's public humiliation of me, and my abrupt departure. "I'm so sorry, Fannie. That's absolutely awful," Susan said when I finished. "What can I do to help?" "I need to know my legal rights regarding the vendor contracts. Most of them are in my name since I provided the payments. If I cancel the remaining payments, what are the potential consequences?" Susan's tone shifted from sympathetic friend to professional advisor. "Let me be clear. You're considering withholding the final payments for wedding services that are currently in progress." "Yes. Specifically, I'm wondering about services that haven't been fully rendered yet or where the final payment hasn't been processed. Send me the contracts right away. I need to review the exact language before advising you." While I scanned and emailed the documents to Susan, I began making a list of all the vendors with outstanding payments. The hotel had a final payment due at midnight for the reception venue and guest accommodations. The photographer and videographer had received deposits, but were expecting final payment at the conclusion of the event. The florist had been paid in full, but the DJ service had a balance due. The post-wedding brunch scheduled for tomorrow morning at the hotel was a separate contract with payment due at the time of the event. My phone rang 15 minutes later. "I've reviewed the contracts," Susan said without preamble. "You're the contracting party on all of them, not Michael or Veronica. The hotel agreement specifically requires your signature or verbal authorization for final payment processing. Same with the photography and DJ contracts. So legally I can withhold payment without their consent. Yes, but there are potential complications. The services are already in progress, which means you'd be canceling midway through fulfillment. The vendors could potentially sue for the remaining balances, claiming they performed in good faith. But they would have to sue me, not Michael or Veronica." "Correct. You're the responsible party on these contracts." I considered this information carefully. What if I'm not canceling entirely, but rather modifying the service level to match what's already been paid? For instance, the photographer has received a 50% deposit. Could I legally instruct him to provide 50% of the contracted service? Susan was quiet for a moment. "That's actually quite clever. Most of these contracts have language about partial fulfillment in case of unforeseen circumstances. If you frame it as adjusting the scope to match the payment already received, you might avoid breach of contract issues." "Thank you, Susan. I know what I need to do now." "Fannie, one more thing," she added before hanging up. "Document everything. If you speak to vendors, follow up with emails confirming what was discussed. Keep records of all communications." After ending the call, I took a deep breath and began methodically working through my list. My first call was to the Beaumont Hotel's event manager. "This is Fannie Williams regarding the Pierce Williams wedding currently in progress. I began my business voice firmly in place. There's been a change of plans regarding final payments. Mrs. Williams, yes. We have the credit card authorization scheduled for midnight processing. Is there an issue? I'm canceling that authorization effective immediately, I stated. The services already rendered covered by the substantial deposit will suffice. No additional charges are to be processed on my card. Ma'am, that would mean terminating the reception at 10 p.m. rather than midnight as contracted, the manager explained, clearly flustered. The bar service would also end immediately. I understand. Please make the necessary arrangements and inform the wedding party of the adjusted timeline. You can reference the force majeure clause in Section 7 of our contract if there are any questions. Similar conversations followed with the photographer. Please complete the minimum contracted hours, then conclude your services. The videographer, raw footage only, no editing package. And the DJ, service ends at 10 p.m. concurrent with the venue. I sent follow-up emails to each vendor explicitly revoking any previous payment authorizations and clarifying the adjusted service expectations. The call to cancel the post-wedding brunch was the simplest. Since the event hadn't started, I was within the 24-hour cancellation window and only forfeited the modest deposit. Throughout this process, my phone buzzed repeatedly with calls and texts from Michael, Veronica, and even Margaret Pierce. I ignored them all, focused entirely on completing my task. Only when I had contacted every vendor did I review the messages. Michael. Mom, what happened? Where did you go? Michael, Veronica says you two had a disagreement. Please come back. Michael, Mom, please answer your phone. Michael. The hotel says the reception has to end early. What's going on? Veronica. This is completely unprofessional and embarrassing. Veronica. My father will cover the payments. Your petty revenge isn't working. Veronica. You're only hurting Michael with this childish behavior. Margaret Fanny. This is beyond inappropriate. The Pierce family name carries weight in this city. Consider the consequences of your actions. I composed a single text to Michael. When you choose to respect me again, we'll talk. Not before. Then I turned off my phone, poured myself a glass of wine, and sat in my garden as twilight descended. There was a strange peace in having finally stood up for myself after months of allowing my boundaries to be trampled. Whatever happened next, I had refused to be a doormat any longer. Around 11 o'clock, exhaustion finally overtook me. I went upstairs to my bedroom, removed the blue dress I had so carefully chosen, and hung it in the back of my closet. I knew I would never wear it again. The associations were too painful. As I lay in bed, I expected to feel guilty or anxious about my actions. Instead, I felt oddly liberated. I had taught my son an important lesson about consequences, perhaps the most valuable wedding gift I could have given him. Whether he would recognize its value remained to be seen. For the first time in months, I slept deeply and dreamlessly, unburdened by the weight of pretense I had been carrying. The harsh trilling of my doorbell woke me the next morning. Sunlight streamed through my bedroom curtains, and a glance at the clock showed it was just past 9, later than I usually slept, but understandable given the previous day's events. The doorbell rang again, more insistently this time, followed by loud knocking. I pulled on my robe and went downstairs, fairly certain who I would find on my doorstep. Looking through the peephole confirmed my suspicion. Michael and Veronica stood on my porch, both still in their clothes, from the night before, their faces tight with anger and exhaustion. Taking a deep breath, I opened the door, but remained firmly in the doorway, not inviting them in. "You had no right," Veronica began immediately, her voice shrill with indignation. "Do you have any idea how humiliating that was? The reception shut down during our first dance. The photographer left before the cake cutting. Michael looked haggard, his tuxedo shirt wrinkled and bow tie undone. Mom, what were you thinking? You ruined our wedding." I studied my son's face, the face I had known from his first moments through childhood illnesses, teenage frustrations, and adult accomplishments. I barely recognized him now, standing before me, not as the thoughtful young man I had raised, but as an extension of the entitled woman beside him. "I'm thinking we should continue this conversation inside calmly," I replied evenly. "If you're capable of that." I stepped back, allowing them entry. In my living room, I gestured to the sofa, but remained standing. "Coffee," I offered, maintaining the composed demeanor I had perfected through years of handling difficult catering clients. "We didn't come for coffee," Veronica snapped. "We came for an explanation and to tell you that you'll be reimbursing us for all the vendor balances my father had to cover last night." "Actually, Edward didn't have to cover anything," I corrected her. "I didn't cancel the services outright. I simply adjusted them to match the deposits already paid, approximately 50% of the contracted amounts. The vendors fulfilled their obligations accordingly." "That was never your decision to make." Veronica's voice rose again. "It was our wedding, which I was paying for," I reminded her calmly. "A fact that seemed to escape your memory when you modified contracts without my consent and publicly humiliated me in front of 200 guests. Michael stepped forward, his expression a mixture of anger and confusion. "What are you talking about, Mom? What contract modifications?" I went to my desk and retrieved the folder of wedding documentation, removing the hotel contract with its attached amendment. 2 days before the wedding, Veronica downgraded the bar service from premium to standard and reallocated the difference, nearly $5,000, to additional floral arrangements, without consulting me. Michael turned to his new wife, brow furrowed. "Veronica." "It was a minor adjustment," she dismissed with a wave of her hand. "The flowers needed upgrading for the Instagram backdrop." She also reduced the dessert station by half and canceled the late-night snack service entirely. I continued pulling out more documentation. Again without discussion, despite the fact that I was paying for everything. Michael's expression changed subtly as he reviewed the paperwork. "Why didn't you tell me about these changes?" "Because they weren't important," Veronica insisted. "And that still doesn't justify what your mother did. She deliberately sabotaged our wedding out of spite." "No, I withdrew financial support from people who demonstrated they didn't respect me," I corrected. "There's a significant difference." I sat down in my reading chair facing them directly. "From the moment I met you, Veronica, you have treated me as if I were beneath you. You've mocked my home, my business, and my values. You've systematically excluded me from wedding traditions that were meaningful to me. You've influenced my son to become someone who stands silently while his mother is publicly attacked." "That's not fair," Michael began, but I held up my hand. "Let me finish. I have contributed over $80,000 to a wedding where I was seated in the third row during the ceremony and at a distant table during the reception. A wedding where my opinions were dismissed, my traditions ignored, and my generosity taken for granted. And when I dared to question one unauthorized change, I was told to go away because I wasn't wanted by my own son." "I never said that," Michael protested. "Those were Veronica's words, not mine." "Your silence was confirmation enough," I replied quietly. "When someone insults your mother in public and you say nothing, you might as well be speaking the words yourself." Michael had the grace to look ashamed, but Veronica was unmoved. "This is exactly the manipulative guilt-tripping Michael warned me about," she said coldly, "making everything about your feelings, your sacrifices." I turned my attention fully to her. "Veronica, I have tried very hard to find something to like about you. I've made allowances for your different background, your youth, your obvious insecurities masked by arrogance. But the simple truth is that you saw my son as raw material to be shaped into something that would impress your social circle, not as the wonderful person he already was." "How dare you psychoanalyze me?" she sputtered. "You know nothing about me or my relationship with Michael. I know that you told your friends he was salvageable with the right guidance. I know you consistently undermined his relationship with me. And I know that a woman who truly loved my son would never have tried to humiliate his mother on his wedding day." Michael sat down heavily on the sofa, looking between Veronica and me with growing conflict in his eyes. "The bar service," he said slowly. "You really changed that without telling anyone, Veronica." "It was a budget decision," she insisted. "The premium package was wasteful." "But it wasn't your budget to adjust," he countered, his voice taking on an edge I hadn't heard him use with her before. "You knew my mom was stretching herself financially for this wedding. Why would you reallocate funds without discussing it? Because she wouldn't have agreed to the changes I needed." Veronica's composure finally cracked. The wedding had to be perfect for Daddy's associates. The original flowers looked cheap. The premium alcohol wasn't necessary for impression. No one checks the brand of vodka in their cocktail, but everyone photographs the floral installations. Her words hung in the air, revealing more than she intended about her priorities. Michael stared at her, as if seeing her clearly for the first time. "And that justifies telling my mother she wasn't welcome at our wedding?" he asked quietly. She was making a scene over wine. Veronica's voice rose defensively. "On my wedding day, after everything we've done to include her despite her limitations." "Limitations," Michael repeated. "You know what I mean. Her lack of sophistication, her embarrassing little catering business, the way she talks about hard work, as if that's something to be proud of, rather than a sign you weren't smart enough to make connections that matter." With each word, Veronica seemed to forget I was in the room, focusing entirely on justifying herself to Michael. And with each word, I could see my son's expression changing, hardening, with a realization too long in coming. "That embarrassing little catering business put me through college without debt," he said slowly. "It provided for our family after my father died. My mother built it from nothing while raising 2 boys alone. And that's very commendable." Veronica backpedaled, suddenly aware she had overstepped. "But surely you understand that in our world that kind of background needs to be minimized." "Our world?" Michael stood up, creating distance between himself and Veronica. "I grew up in this house, Veronica. This is my world. My mother's values are my values. Or at least they were before I met you." The tension in the room was palpable. I remained silent, recognizing that this was a moment of reckoning between Michael and his new wife that needed to unfold without my intervention. "You're upset," Veronica said, her tone softening as she reached for Michael's hand. "We all are. It was a stressful night. Let's go back to the hotel, get some rest, and discuss this rationally later." Michael stepped away from her touch. "I think I need some time to process everything. Alone. Alone. We're supposed to leave for our honeymoon this afternoon." Veronica's conciliatory mask slipped again. "The villa in Santorini is non-refundable." "I'm sure your father can afford the loss," Michael replied with unexpected sharpness. "After all, appearances are what matter most, right?" Veronica looked between us, suddenly realizing she was losing control of the narrative. "This is your doing," she said to me, her voice low with fury. "You've always been jealous of our relationship. You couldn't stand that Michael was finally escaping your emotional manipulation." "I've said very little during this conversation," I pointed out. "Most of the revelations have come from your own words, Veronica." She grabbed her purse from the sofa, straightening to her full height. "This isn't over. My father has connections throughout this city. He'll make sure your little catering business suffers for this humiliation." The threat might have intimidated me once, but after everything that had transpired, it seemed almost laughably petty. "Feel free to tell Edward he can contact my attorney with any concerns, Susan Chen of Chen Borowski and Associates. I believe their firm has represented several of his competitors in recent development disputes." Veronica's face flushed with anger as she stormed toward the door. "Michael, are you coming or staying with Mommy dearest?" My son looked at her, then at me, conflict written across his features. "I'll call you later, Veronica. I need some time." After a moment of disbelieving silence, she slammed the door behind her, leaving Michael and me alone in a house filled with memories of a different life before wealth and status had complicated our relationship. "I don't know what to say." He finally spoke, his voice hollow with exhaustion and confusion. "You don't need to say anything right now," I told him gently. "Just think about what kind of life and what kind of partner will truly make you happy in the long run." He nodded, running a hand through his disheveled hair. "Can I use my old room for a while? I don't think going back to the hotel is a good idea right now." "Of course. It's still your home, Michael. It always will be." As he climbed the stairs to the bedroom where he had grown up, I remained in the living room, aware that the events set in motion by my decision to withdraw wedding funding were far from resolved. There would be more difficult conversations, more painful revelations, perhaps even legal threats from the Pierce family. Yet for the first time in 3 years, I felt hopeful about my relationship with my son. Whatever happened next, truth had finally pierced the carefully constructed facade that had been separating us. and truth, however uncomfortable, was always the necessary foundation for healing. The weeks following Michael and Veronica's disastrous wedding unfolded in ways I couldn't have predicted. Michael stayed in his childhood bedroom for 3 days, emerging only for meals and brief, subdued conversations. He called in sick to work, ignored most of Veronica's increasingly frantic messages, and spent hours staring at old family photo albums I kept in the living room bookcase. On the 4th day, James, my younger son, arrived unexpectedly from California, his concerned face appearing at my kitchen door as I prepared lunch. "I caught the first flight I could get," he explained, embracing me tightly. "Michael called and told me everything, or at least his version of everything." "I'm so glad you're here," I said, genuinely relieved to have my younger son's steady presence. "It's been difficult." James had always been the more emotionally perceptive of my sons, quick to understand undercurrents and unspoken tensions. Over coffee at the kitchen table, I shared my perspective on the events leading up to and including the wedding day. James listened without interruption, his expression growing increasingly troubled. "I should have said something months ago," he admitted when I finished. "I noticed how Veronica treated you at Christmas, and again when I visited in March. But Michael seemed so happy, so I kept my concerns to myself. You were trying to support your brother." "Maybe, or maybe I was just avoiding conflict." James sighed. "I never liked her mom. There was something calculated about the way she related to people, assessing their value to her rather than connecting with them authentically." The sound of footsteps on the stairs announced Michael's presence before he appeared in the doorway, surprise registering on his face at the sight of his brother. "James, what are you doing here?" "Moral support," James replied, simply standing to embrace his older brother. "For both of you." The brothers had always been different, Michael more serious and driven, James more laid back and intuitive, but their bond had remained strong despite the geographic distance between them. Seeing them together now, I was struck by how adult they had become, no longer the boys who had played in this very kitchen while I prepared meals between catering gigs. "I've been thinking a lot," Michael said as he joined us at the table. "About Dad, about how you raised us after he died, about the values that used to be important to me." "Used to be?" I asked gently. Michael stared into his coffee cup. "Somewhere along the way, I started believing that status and connections mattered more than integrity or genuine relationships. Veronica didn't create that change in me. She just accelerated what was already happening." "The finance world can do that to people," James observed. "All those zeros tend to distort perspective." "It's not just the money," Michael continued. "It's the constant pressure to appear successful, to move in the right circles, to impress the right people. I started thinking of my background, our family, as something to overcome rather than something to be proud of." The admission clearly cost him shame coloring his face as he finally met my eyes. "I'm so sorry, Mom, for everything." "I know you are," I said, reaching for his hand across the table. "The question is, what happens next?" That question hung in the air between us, unanswered but pressing. Michael had made vows to Veronica just days earlier, however disastrous the celebration had turned out to be. Legal and emotional complications awaited him regardless of his next steps. Our family conversation was interrupted by a knock at the door, not the angry pounding of Veronica's previous visit, but a tentative, almost hesitant sound. James went to answer it, returning moments later with an unexpected visitor. "Tyler?" Michael stood surprised to see his best friend from college, the same friend who had been his best man, but had been notably absent from the post-wedding drama. Tyler looked uncomfortable, clutching his phone and shifting his weight from foot to foot. "Sorry to barge in, Mrs. Williams. Michael, I thought you should see something before it potentially goes public." He held out his phone, a video paused on the screen. "I recorded parts of the reception on my phone, including that moment with Veronica. A few people did. I wanted you to be aware that it's circulating among some of the guests." Michael took the phone, and I moved to watch over his shoulder as he pressed play. The video showed Veronica in her wedding gown, finger pointed aggressively, her face contorted with anger as she shouted, "You're not welcome here! Go away!" The camera then panned to capture my stunned expression before following me as I walked with dignity toward the exit. "There's more," Tyler said quietly. "From earlier in the evening before you arrived, Mrs. Williams." He took the phone back, scrolled to another clip, and handed it to Michael again. This video showed Veronica with her bridesmaids, champagne in hand, laughing as she said, "Can you believe his mother wanted to cater this, with her little sandwich shop staff, as if my father's associates would eat food prepared by lunch ladies?" Michael's face hardened as he watched the muscles in his jaw working. "Who has seen these?" "Mostly just the wedding party so far," Tyler replied. "But you know how these things spread. I thought you should be prepared." "Thank you for showing us," I said, genuinely grateful despite the painful content. "Would you like to stay for lunch? I'm making sandwiches." I couldn't help adding the last part with a small ironic smile. Tyler accepted the invitation, and as we ate, he shared more observations from the wedding and the months leading up to it. As Michael's best friend since their freshman year of college, Tyler had witnessed the entire progression of the relationship with Veronica. "She systematically separated you from people who knew the real you," he told Michael. "Remember Dave and Sarah? You stopped hanging out with them right after they questioned whether Veronica was right for you." "I thought they were jealous of my success," Michael admitted. "They were concerned about their friend," Tyler corrected, "just like I was. But I stayed quiet, figuring you'd see through her eventually." After Tyler left, promising to let us know if the videos gained wider circulation, Michael seemed more resolute than confused. "I need to end this," he said simply. "The marriage, I mean. It was a mistake from the beginning." "That's a significant decision," I cautioned, though part of me was relieved. "Are you sure you're not just reacting to the immediate crisis?" "I'm sure," he said firmly. Watching those videos, seeing Veronica's true character captured so plainly, it was like the final piece of a puzzle falling into place. I've been ignoring red flags for 3 years because I was seduced by the lifestyle she represented. But that's not who I want to be anymore. Over the following days, Michael consulted with an attorney about annulment possibilities, discovering that the circumstances, including material misrepresentation and fraud, potentially qualified under state law. Veronica's unauthorized changes to wedding contracts provided documentation of financial deception, while the videos offered evidence of her true attitude toward Michael's family and background. Throughout this process, I maintained a supportive but neutral position, careful not to push Michael in any particular direction. This had to be his decision made for his own reasons, not to please me or repair our relationship. 1 month after the wedding, Michael officially moved out of the apartment he had shared with Veronica during their engagement. The annulment proceedings had begun contested vigorously by Veronica's father's attorneys, but proceeding nonetheless. What surprised me most during this tumultuous period was a conversation Michael initiated one evening as we sat in the garden after dinner. "I've been thinking about my career," he said, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of pink and orange. "I don't think I want to continue in investment banking." "Oh," I tried to keep my tone neutral, though this was unexpected news. "What are you considering instead?" "Working with you," he replied, turning to gauge my reaction. "In the catering business, eventually expanding it, maybe finally opening that restaurant you and Dad always dreamed about." The suggestion caught me completely off guard. "Michael, you have a successful finance career. You don't need to make such a dramatic change because of what happened with Veronica." "It's not because of Veronica," he insisted. "Or at least not entirely. I've been unhappy in finance for years, Mom. The constant pressure, the ethical compromises, the soulless pursuit of more money just for the sake of having it. I stayed because I thought it gave me status, made me important. But I was happiest when I was helping you in the kitchen as a teenager." "The hours are long, the work is physically demanding, and the profits are modest compared to what you're used to," I reminded him. He smiled, the first genuine smile I'd seen from him in weeks. "All true. But I'd be building something meaningful. Something with heart and integrity, working with family instead of cutthroat competitors. Dad would approve, don't you think?" Tears pricked my eyes at the mention of Robert, at the thought of our son carrying forward the dream that had been cut short by tragedy. "Your father would be very proud," I managed to say. 3 months after the wedding, that wasn't Michael and I signed papers making him a partner in Fanny's Homestyle Catering. His financial expertise immediately proved valuable as we reassessed our business model and expansion opportunities. The annulment had been finalized, with Veronica ultimately accepting a settlement rather than risking more embarrassing revelations in court. Most surprising was the discovery that the Pierce family's supposedly unassailable wealth had been largely smoke and mirrors. Edward's development company had been teetering on the edge of bankruptcy for years, leveraged to the hilt with high-interest loans. His threats against my business never materialized as he became embroiled in his own legal troubles with creditors. 6 months after the wedding debacle, we celebrated the holidays with a quiet family gathering at my home. James flew in from California again, bringing his new girlfriend Sarah, a marine biologist, with a quick laugh and unpretentious manner. Michael, though still healing from the Veronica experience, seemed genuinely content with our new professional partnership and the simpler lifestyle he had embraced. As we sat around the dinner table that Christmas Eve, enjoying a meal we had prepared together, I realized that the painful experience of Michael's wedding had ultimately led to an unexpected gift: the restoration of our family bonds, stronger perhaps than they had been before. The money I had saved by withdrawing the final wedding payments, roughly $35,000, had become the seed funding for our newest venture, a small restaurant in downtown Boston, specializing in the kind of home-style comfort food that had built my catering reputation. We named it Roberts, in honor of the man whose dream it had originally been. On opening night, as I watched Michael confidently managing the front of house while I supervised the kitchen, I felt a sense of completion I hadn't experienced in years. The path to this moment had been winding and sometimes painful, but standing up for myself at that wedding had ultimately saved more than my dignity. It had saved my relationship with my son and redirected both our lives toward authentic fulfillment. To family. Michael proposed a toast later that evening after the last customers had departed and only our small staff remained. And to the courage to protect what truly matters. I raised my glass to that sentiment, grateful for the wisdom that comes from weathering life's storms and emerging stronger on the other side. Have you ever had to make a difficult decision that damaged a relationship in the short term, but ultimately led to healing? Or have you experienced the pain of watching a loved one change under someone else's influence? Share your story in the comments below. I'd love to hear how you navigated similar challenges in your own families. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share with anyone who might need to be reminded that sometimes the most loving thing we can do is stand firm in our self-respect. Thank you for listening to my journey, and remember that it's never too late to reclaim your voice and your values.